Hey, it's Drybear, and I've gotten a ton of comments with the recent release of Dark and Darker coming to Steam for free, talking about the game and the genre and wondering what's happening with it. So let's dive into that today. Now, if you haven't played Dark and Darker, it is essentially a extraction game. It is focused on more old school traditional dungeon diving with a huge inspiration from Dungeons and Dragons. And the concept is actually very appealing. The idea that you have these old school traditional like tabletop style classes like cleric or wizard, and you're going down into the dungeons trying to find things that you can bring back with you. And as the name would suggest, it is dark down there. You never know what you're going to find, and there are tons and tons of experience out there for people playing tabletop RPGs, running into all these really cool encounters of running into bosses, stepping on traps, triggering effects, and we see this a lot in media as well, especially animation, talking about labyrinth exposure and exploring, finding all these cool little things that happen. You get teleported somewhere, something bad happens to somebody. So the idea of exploring the depths of an unknown dungeon, looking for loot, or just the adventure of it is really awesome. And if you're interested, I put out a beginner's guide on Dark and Darker yesterday, but a lot of the comments I'm seeing, at least over the last 24 hours, are people saying that I wouldn't play Dark and Darker primarily because it's PvP, the fact that you are entering in with other people. Now, they have multiple modes. You can do solos where you're going against one, everyone's one person, there's no parties. You can do duos and even trios, so you and a party can go down in there. But unlike other situations where it's mostly just you against the environment, or the encounters and the actual area that you're trying to get through unscathed, there are other players down there that can set up traps for you, try to take you out, steal your gear, and if you do end up perishing down in the dungeons, you will end up losing everything on you and you'll have to start over again. And what's fascinating about this game and this genre is it hasn't really fully taken off. We've seen the idea of extraction do pretty well with games like Escape from Tarkov, where it's focused on putting your life on the line, and in many cases games like BR or even just hardcore or permadeath modes in any kind of game adds that extra thrill. It gets your blood pumping, thinking I am going to lose everything if I perish here, and so you get super locked in and you're focused on what's happening in front of you. But does that experience actually need other enemy players to make it good? Should Dark and Darker have a PvE or PvE only mode that probably shouldn't share gear, where you can just focus on going down, fighting monsters, and maybe see how low you can go? This is a very common trope of just going down the edges of a maze or a labyrinth or a dungeon trying to get through all of the crazy things that await you. And while this genre is very much unexplored right now, there have been other lookalikes or similar games that have come out. None of them have really struck the same as Dark and Darker. We've seen things like Mortal Sin, or even some of the PvE focused aspects like Vampire Survivors, or Halls of Torment, which are top-down, focused on just trying to fight off hordes of enemies, but none of them really capture the dungeon exploration. We did actually get Greed is Good, which had unfortunately many performance issues that made it difficult to play and difficult for it to grow in popularity, and we even have games on the horizon like Dungeonborn, which does look to be pretty good. Mortal Sin tried to capture the experience of going through that area, but it was more of like an arcade action game more than just the risking your life to find the loot kind of game. Halls of Torment was a completely different perspective and different focus on the gameplay you were seeing, and a lot of it was just around the Vampire Survivors-like genre of exploring an area and fighting off huge hordes of enemies, not quite the same as what we're talking about here. Dungeonborn, which is on the horizon, looks like it could possibly satisfy this same idea, and it does actually seem to be a big available area of gaming where developers can actually dive into and see some success, given the fact there are a lot of people that really enjoy the core experience of Dark and Darker, but may not want to have the PvP as part of their experience. They want to explore these areas, live out their own RPG fantasy. And that's actually part of the experience for CRPGs as well, is you have all these different interactions that you'll get into step by step in a tactical system. There aren't as many real-time focused on dungeon dungeon crawling RPG experiences like Dungeonborn or Dark and Darker, or even Greed is Good, that focus on that specific experience. Now, one of the downsides with no PvP, if you didn't know about this about development in general, if you don't have other players, players exist as content for a game. And you can look at it that way, especially as a developer, because the players create the encounters that you're facing, the encounters that you're engaging with, and they get your blood pumping without them needing to, focus on creating some cool PvE encounter. So PvE generally tends to be more expensive. This is why you see recent games like Call of Duty having shorter and shorter campaigns outside of Black Ops 6, which look like it's going to have a full-blown campaign. Even games that have Escape from Tarkov, which we mentioned earlier, is adding a PvE mode, but for an exorbitant price for premium members that are paying for that PvE experience. Same thing goes for Overwatch and Overwatch 2. They said they were going to add PvP and then ultimately didn't because they ended up not adding it as part of their dev pipeline. So PvE is incredibly expensive to do well, and PvP is a lot cheaper because the player versus player aspect is what allows you to create that dynamic environment where you have actual gameplay going on because you're trying to outsmart, outwit, or outplay another human being. So at least from a practical standpoint, it makes sense that Dark and Darker doesn't have focus on PvE, but it does have PvE elements. Each map of the 3 maps that exist in the game now does have mini bosses and a full boss. There's tons of different enemies that you can face, and there's also options to go further down into the Inferno modes, which have even more loot and brand new enemies. So you could actually create, based on what's there right now, a higher difficulty version of Dark and Darker with a PvE aspect on it. You're not going to get raided or ganked or killed by other players as you're going down, and whether you're going solo or with your teammates is something separate. Now, you kind of get that experience with the Inferno modes going down one level because usually people don't follow you down that way, but it's kind of shocking how many people are either on board with Dark and Darker because they enjoy the PvP and the general gameplay loop versus the amount of people that are very much against Dark and Darker simply because they wish it had no enemy players in it, which to me tells me that there's a big genre that's available for this. So let me know what you think. Are you someone who enjoys the basic loop that includes PvP, or does the idea of being ganked in these dungeon crawling style games ruin the experience for you and take you out of that immersion of being inside of a dungeon or a labyrinth, fighting random monsters or unforeseen enemies, looking for really strong loot? Because there's certainly a big difference in facing a PvE enemy that is poorly implemented or doesn't have the strongest AI. Even in Dark and Darker right now, you can get enemies stuck somewhere, you can hit them over walls, you can get them trapped on things. If the pathing isn't great or the encounter isn't perfect, it's very hard to make those challenging in really proper ways. And I think CRPGs do this really well because they have the more tactical turn-based top-down system with some of the movement restrictions and abilities that go into it that's not just pure fantasy real-time like Dark and Darker. And you could probably even get some of that experience with games that are more of the Souls-like or action RPG focus that kind of have this format. But again, there isn't really any other games besides Dark and Darker or maybe even Dungeonborn on the horizon that have been scratching that exact itch for that kind of game. Now, if you haven't checked out Dark and Darker yet, I recommend at least giving it a shot, especially the free version of the game. I have a beginner's guide out for the game as well if you wanted to check that out, and I think it is a great experience. The more you play it, the more you get into it, the more you escape, you still get those same experiences, especially if you're into the idea of permadeath extraction style modes. But I do also recommend wishlisting Dungeonborn, which is on the horizon. They're having their final playtest at the beginning of July, so just a few weeks. And hopefully if the game is as good as it looks, there could be a nice competitor for Dark and Darker. And I think that that's where game genres thrive. When they actually have competitors that compete head to head, they encourage each other to do more and more, to up the ante, to increase the presentation, the experience, the options, and they fight for that spot in your heart for which game is actually better. And I think that this is very Dark and Darker inspired, and I can't wait to get my hands on it. If you found value in today's video, leave a like down below, leave a comment for the algorithm to help this video get seen by more people, and don't forget to check out my other channels for other content and other stuff and other things.